So Mahmood Mamdani is one of the leading scholars of what we used to call, my generation used to call, the third world, which is now unfortunately called the global south. I think third world has got more character in it, just the title. And he's written extensively about oppression, violence, colonialism, freedom, alternate ways of being in the world, politically, culturally. And he's one of those scholars who's located in multiple regions of the world, and especially in Uganda, Kampala, where he's worked and written, and represents a vision for Africa in many ways, and for what I would still call the third world, the larger underdeveloped, developing countries, whatever you want to call them. So we're going to talk about his book today. It says that this is a book launch, although the book is, I think, 3 years old or 4 years old now, but never too late to launch a book in Pakistan. It's always welcome. So the book is, so I asked Mahmood I said, why don't you give us a little synopsis of your book? He said, why don't you? So I'm not going to do that very well, but I'll talk a little bit about it, because what it does is it looks at a sort of how the nation states, the post-colonial states, were created and imbricated in the idea of colonialism, and how colonialism was also made through this idea of the nation state. And especially how modernity and post-modernity in later years, they evolved over a period of time, over decades and centuries, and how they interacted with each other. So his work looks at this notion of what is a minority and what does it mean to minoritize populations, people. And for people like us who before 1947 were considered a minority in India, in United India, in colonial India, this notion of minority and majority plays a very important role. And today we've wiped out all our minorities, at least in Pakistan. There are no minorities. I mean, they barely exist. They're hardly there. So what he does is he talks about, in his book, he talks about 5 specific regions where he looks at how indigenous populations, people living there, like what are now unfortunately called the indigenous, the American, what are they called, the American Indians or the Red Indians? What are they called in the US? The native Indians. I mean, the native people of North America, the United States. And I think in his book he writes that the United States was the first real colonizer of people, and the United States prepared a template from which others learned. And of course, there's the case of Germany and the Jews, and that's one chapter in his book. And of course, South Africa. He lives in Africa, and South Africa, for our generation, for our presence, has had a very real existence from Nelson Mandela and apartheid and so on and so forth. And also there's Sudan, something that we don't know very much about. At least people here, I didn't know much about it until I read his book. And of course, there's the perpetual question of Israel, Palestine and Israel. So these are some of the themes that he looks at in the chapters in his books, and how this notion of minoritization takes place. So I want to start, I read the book, and I want to start with a question about multiple questions, many questions. So how he talks about this idea of a European modernity. I mean, something that Tahir Kamran is here, he's a historian. There are others who I don't know, who study history and politics. How this idea of a colonial modernity and a European modernity was imposed on indigenous people all over the world. So that's something that we know. We're familiar with it. It's part of this region as well. But I wanted to know whether there was any notion of a non-European modernity. The natives who were always supposedly modernized, a modernity was imposed on them. Whether they're in the regions that you've studied, or of course perhaps in the 1500 and 1600, that question does not arise. But later on, in the 20th century, for example, whether you find notions of a non-European modernity, or I don't want to call it a native modernity, but in a sense a modernity which differs from that of the colonials or the Europeans. So that's the first question. Then I'll lead on to others.
Thank you, Akbar, and thank you to LitFest for ThinkFest. Sorry, I'm behind times. For inviting me. There was actually supposed to be a book launch, according to Bangash. And this is the Urdu translation of my book, which has been done by Vanguard. And they said it would launch today. So modernity. So this book is about political modernity. Not all modernity. And what I mean by political modernity is the notion that every nation must have its own state. And every state must be defined by the nation that owns it. And that notion is a very specifically European notion. It begins in the 15th century. It begins in the Iberian Peninsula. It begins with the eviction of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. It mobilizes around the slogan, one religion, one country, one people. So the nation in that particular context is religion. And the Iberian nation is a religious nation. The immediate effect of it is the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. The medium-term effect, as these waves are carried into neighboring lands, and the project of the nation state begins to become a European project, you have religious wars all over. Mainly wars between Catholics and Protestants. 100 Years' War, more than 100 years, it becomes a Europe-wide problem. The problem is solved theoretically by the English philosopher John Locke in his Letter on Toleration. And Locke proposes a solution. His solution is that the majority and the minority can live together. How do they live together? The minority must accept that the majority has power. So he's writing of England. And he says Catholics must pay homage to the English state and not to the Pope. And in return, the majority should respect the rights of the minority. The majority has power, sovereignty. The minority has rights. This is the trade-off. But there's a second trade-off. Second trade-off is that the majority becomes a permanent majority now, and the minority becomes a permanent minority. Catholics are a permanent minority and Protestants a permanent majority in England. These are not democratic majorities, because in a democracy, the majority is created and confirmed at every election period. And the returns in the election decide who is the majority and around what issues. And the only reason you can convince a minority to stick to this is because it has the hope that one day it can become a majority. Because majorities coalesce around issues. And if issues are supported broadly, then that broad constituency becomes a majority. But now the majority is determined prior to the election and after the election. It's a religious majority in this particular case. Now, John Locke's solution is translated into an international treaty called the Treaty of Westphalia. And in the Treaty of Westphalia, the nation-state system is confirmed as a European system. And it basically rests on the Lockean contract, which is every state has a majority which is sovereign, and its sovereignty will be recognized by all other states, provided this sovereign state respects the rights of the minorities. And that system holds until the First World War. Right? That system spreads to the rest of the world, not because it is imposed. I don't think so. Because it's bought. We buy it. We say we are a nation and we must have our own state. Partha Chatterjee wrote a book about it, on the Indian majority which bought this idea. Now it's beginning to unravel. You can see it in this region. How majorities have hardened. Right? Start with China. And look at what has happened to Tibet, what has happened to the Uyghurs. These are now minorities which are not tolerated. This Westphalian tolerance, see, the idea of tolerance is liberal phase of nation state. But once tolerance goes, you return to the non-liberal phase. So you look at China, you look at India, the Hindutva project now. The Indian project has been, I actually think of it as having unfolded in 3 different phases. In the first phase, which is the partition, the first victims of the nation-state project in India are the Muslims in India. The Muslims became homeless. They had no sovereignty to share in. They became a totally vulnerable minority. The second set of victims were the Muslims in Pakistan, because the Pakistani state now gave itself the right to decide who is a Muslim. Right? Who is a Muslim? And which Muslims are minorities? Forget the minorities, they say don't exist anymore, but which Muslims are minorities? What about the Wahhabis? What about the Shia? So on and so forth. And the third sect of victims, we're turning the corner, are the Hindus in India. Because the Indian state will decide who is a Hindu. If Hindus are going to have privileges to be enforced by the state, then the state gives itself the right to decide who is a Hindu. Is a Sikh a Hindu? Is a Jain a Hindu? Are the Shivites Hindus? Are the Vaishnavites Hindus? Okay, right now you have this broad coalition called Hindutva. But the project is still being built. Once the project is built, that's the time of fragmentation, disintegration. It's the fight for spoils. You can see Sri Lanka, what's happened to the Tamils. Pakistan, I've just talked about. You can see Iran, the non-Shia population in Iran, right? So this entire region, regardless of what religious persuasion, seems to be following a single broad pattern. Sorry.
I want to return to the book because I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Because I think we've.
I want to write another book.
Oh, it looks like it. He's just finished a book on Uganda and Idi Amin as well. So I think now he's got time. So one of the things that I found very particular in your book, I won't say peculiar, was that you talk about the civilizing mission of colonialism, right? I mean, it's something very standard. And you don't talk about the extraction, of resources, of material, of the old, from Marx to Lenin and onwards. And it's almost absent in some ways. It's there, but it's absent because you emphasize a great deal. And I'm not saying you're wrong in that, but I just want you to expand on that because you repeatedly the frame that you're using for colonialism, and I'll come to some other things around that, is of the civilizing mission, the European early modern forces going and civilizing. And the absence of extraction in your book, of resources being transferred to make the West or the Europe wealthier, is not sort of forefront. Now, it's a different take. So I just want you to expand on that.
Thank you. The classical writings on colonialism, whether it's from 19th century in the Indian subcontinent or 20th century in Africa, have focused on the economic side of the relationship between the imperial power and the colony. It was finally crystallized into a theory of dependency, underdevelopment. Walter Rodney, here in this part of the world, it was known as drain theory. Walter Rodney wrote how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And this became the standard explanation of the crises that followed independence. That we continue to be colonized. The proof is that we continue to be, our resources continue to be drained, continue to be taken by the former imperial powers. At some point, and for me the dividing line was the Rwanda genocide, the question began to change. The question was, okay, this was the history. How come it continues? What happened? And the question began to change from how Europe exploited Africa to how Europe ruled Africa. And what was that system of rule? So it became a more explicitly political question. So I'm not saying that the economic side of the story is not important, it is. But I'm saying simply that this book addresses the political side of the story. So it doesn't claim to be all and end all answering everything, but it does claim implicitly that the politics is primary. And we don't set the politics right, we'll never get the economy right.
And I think that's an important intervention that you make, because you're right that whether the dependency school or whether the Marxists or whatever, they look at economic extraction, whether it's through the IMF, the World Bank, through globalization, and so the other side of it, as you're saying, is often not mentioned by them. So this also leads to another distinction that you make between direct rule and indirect rule. And I think it builds on what you were just saying, that when you talk about the civilizing mission being a direct rule, a direct by colonialism, which leads to an indirect rule, which is usually by the elite. Who take the role of the colonizer. There's something that you write. You said they take the role of the colonizer once so-called independence takes place. So could you expand on that, because that's in some ways a continuation of the colonial to the post-colonial, supposedly post-independence world. So something about direct rule and indirect rule.
So, in my engagement with the notion of indirect rule was much more in an earlier book called Citizen and Subject. And in Citizen and Subject, I began to explore what was different about colonialism, especially as it moved from India to Africa, and how it developed a set of institutions through which it ruled its new African colonies, and how these institutions were originally cultivated in India but really expanded full-blown in Africa. And the kernel around which these institutions developed was called custom. And custom was the theoretical innovation of Henry Maine, an English legal anthropologist who was part of the Governor General's Law Commission immediately following 1857. And the usual explanations of 1857 was that, see, the Indians are ignorant, they are superstitious, and that's why they revolted against the civilizing mission. And of course, the question raised in the British Parliament was, well, okay, they may be ignorant and superstitious, which is why you say that they wouldn't use these bullets because it had fat from the cow and the pig. But how come it didn't stop them from using the bullets against us? They used the same bullets to kill us. So Henry Maine kind of responds to this very elementary, vulgar kind of question. But his response is that we made an epistemic mistake in India. We did not understand how India was governed for centuries and centuries. And it was not governed by any modern power at the top. He uses the example of Raja Ranjit Singh in Punjab. And he says, Ranjit Singh could give an order, but his order would not carry any further than where his soldiers were. So there was no sovereignty. In that sense, he had no sovereignty. For the order to carry, it's unlike the British Empire, where the order would carry wherever the empire claimed to govern. But, says Maine, the real answer was that Indian villages were controlled by village councils based on custom. And custom is not something which is created, custom is something which is observed. And this notion that the world divides into two kinds of people, one group of people which innovates, improves, legislates, elects representatives who then legislate, is different from the rest of the world which is governed by custom. And custom is time immemorial. So the claim was that British rule post 1857 was not going to be introducing civilization, progress, but was going to defend and conserve custom from those who would want to disrupt it, from the very people created by British rule in the new educational system, the lawyers, the doctors, etc., who were beginning to lead the nationalist movement. So that was the British claim. Now, that I focused on that in this book, Citizen Subject. But then when it came to writing Neither Settler Nor Citizen, my focus narrowed, not on all the colonies, but settler colonies. And it narrowed on the US as the sort of primary kind of model settler colony. And in the US, I became interested in two things. I became interested in the two different ways in which America governed its two principal minorities. One, African slaves, and two, Indians, American Indians. American Indians from whom they took the land, and African slaves who were the source of labor. So these were the two who provided the basis of what America became later on. But what interested me, again, was the political side, which is the different ways in which they governed them and the effects of this difference. So they governed Indians through what today we would call a two-state solution. They created a separate state for Indians, not one but many, called reservations. No, not divide and rule. This is far more sophisticated, which will become clear once I explain how they ruled the Africans. So, which meant that Indians were not part of the American polity. They were separate from it. They were a protectorate in the American polity. When the US passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that act did not apply to Indians. It applied to African Americans, but not to Indians. So, 4 years later, they passed another act called the Indian Civil Rights Act, which did not give civil rights to Indians as something that can be legally enforced, but only as advisory. Why? Because Indians were not part of the US. Indians were part of a separate polity, a protectorate. What was the difference with the African Americans? The African Americans were part of a single state solution. They were not put in reservations anywhere. They were put in plantations, thousands and thousands of plantations. But they were governed under American law. Indians were governed under what they called custom, by customary authorities, supposedly living in their customary homeland. This was the language of custom, which was not amenable to any kind of democratic practices. But the African Americans were not. So, my interest was What difference did it make? Well, it made a huge difference because with African Americans, you can see ever since the Civil War, African Americans have been open to building alliances with different groups in the US, right up to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter actually became the vanguard of the reform movement. It had nothing to do with numbers. African Americans were a small minority, 15%, but politically they became a compelling force. Indians remained fragmented, unable to structurally blocked from building alliances. Right. This I thought was an important lesson to learn from the American experience. Now, the American experience was exported to different parts of the world. I have a feeling your other questions will have to do with this, so I better stop here.
The question that I was going to, because I want to leave plenty of time for conversation with the audience. The other question, the next question I was going to, was something that is very clear in a lot of your earlier work as well, the presence of violence. And of course, colonialism is an extremely violent act, and so is the nation states created after that. In fact, you write that post-colonial nationalism has been deeply violent, and of course, we live that. So I want to move you away from sort of the history or the pattern which you were describing to the presence of violence and how that creates the citizen, if at all, in this era of, from colonialism, from direct rule to indirect rule, where violence is it continues on indigenous people even after the end of colonialism, supposed end of colonialism.
So I was interested in two different kinds of violence. I call one criminal violence and the other political violence. I have a critique of the use of the criminal violence model to understand violence in politics. The prime example is Nuremberg in Germany. So under criminal violence, and you can read this with Human Rights Watch, which is the best exemplar. Okay, for Human Rights Watch, the thing to do in a violent situation is to draw up an account of the violence, identify the perpetrators, name and shame the perpetrators, hold them accountable. So that's what they did in Nuremberg. They identified thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Nazi perpetrators. General Eisenhower remarked that if we take all of these to court, it'll take us at least 50 years. So they began to denazify those with lower level crimes. Ultimately, they still came up with a core. And then Adenauer came up with a solution. He said, no. Let us support Israel. We will give a sort of an annual subsidy to Israel as kind of blood money for what we did. The counterpart, the corollary of it, was that the Nazis were let go. Right? But the more important corollary was Nazism was defeated militarily, but not politically. because the Nazi political objective was confirmed now. Germany is a nation of Germans, not of Jews. Jews have another nation, Israel. So Germany had Nuremberg. The first reversal to Nuremberg is in South Africa. In South Africa, they recognize, well, first of all, they recognize that they can't really arrest all the perpetrators because they have not defeated them militarily. Right? They are at a standstill. Kind of, neither side has won. They realize that they have to have a political solution. They realize that the solution will not come from the courts. Even Steve Biko, who had been killed by police, everybody knew who the police were, which was the station, etc. When his family took the Biko case to court, the court said, no, we will not pronounce on this because at stake is the future of the whole country. So what they had was a political solution, which was, okay, if we agree, we will remain one country. This is a one-state solution. We'll remain one country, and everybody will legally have the same rights. So the South African solution is not criminal. It's a political solution. It has its downside, but can discuss that if anyone is interested. But it points the world to a different way, and it comes up now, of course, with the Gaza situation and Palestine and Israel and these one-state solution, two-state solution, how to deal with the violence. These become real live issues.
How much time do we have? 20. Okay, so I want to. I'm glad you came to South Africa. I had a question about Israel as well, but if there's time, we can talk about that. So you write, and I quote, you said the power of the South African story is that it gives us the glimpse of another possibility. Do you still feel that, given South Africa now, after, 30 years of independence, more than that, is that glimpse of another possibility in terms of assimilation, instead of in the way that you were just going on about it? It is still, and you write you're an optimist in your book. You claim that you're an optimist, but South Africa offer you that optimism now, still?
Well, I mean, I have no illusions about South Africa. The questions that have not been resolved are the questions of social justice. And they will not be resolved until you have a mobilization around the question of social justice. And you have a political movement which is strong enough to deliver social justice to the people. But what South Africa has given us is on the political side. It's given us on the political side, if you an antidote to violence, certain kinds of violence. Because if you look at the violence post-independence in the colonized world, if you look at the violence post-independence in the colonized world, it is basically around the question of who is the nation or who is not the nation, right? Either ethnic cleansing or just disenfranchising. You don't expel them, but you disenfranchise them. And those who are disenfranchised have nowhere else to go. They have no other home. They've been there. they fight back. That's the story of ethnic violence in Africa. That problem was not because of perpetrators. It was a structural problem. It was around issues, and those issues had to be identified and they had to be dealt with. So that's the lesson that South Africa offers us. So may I suggest we...
Open it up to the
Yeah.
audience. Tahir Kamran.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. I heard a lot about you and I read a couple of your books, and it was really my good fortunes to be in this audience listening to you, and it was really insightful. One thing that was really niggling for me, and I wanted to just have clarity, seeing the state of democracy and the neocolonial settings like Pakistan is, as I believe that Pakistan is a neocolonial state, not the post-colonial state. So all the decolonized or, within inverted commas, all those decolonized polities, do you think democracy has ever functioned or as a workable proposition within those Asian and African polities? Because I see that democracy is not a workable proposition there. There needs to be some other model than democracy in Westphalian version of it. Because it's absolutely different, its ethos is different, its historical experience is different, and Africa and Asia hasn't gone through all the processes that Europe has gone through it. So, is democracy holds any promise in those lands? Thank you.
So first, just a distinction. I don't think we should think of Westphalia as a form of democracy. Westphalia is about a form of the state. It's about a nation state. It's the claim that the nation state is the most natural and therefore the only form of the state. And this book of mine is a critique of that. Now, democracy, the question you're asking has been a question that has been asked by many ever since the time of independence. The question has led to an ongoing debate. One side of the debate has been that let's distinguish democracy, which is the claim that a people who are subject to laws should have a meaningful part in the making of those laws. Other debates followed whether the democracy should be representative, so the people elect their delegates who then go to parliament, or whether it should be participatory. That was one set of debate. Another, a broader debate was why should we confuse democracy or equate democracy with the institutions which have been created in particular places over historical time. The institutions may be historically specific to each place, reflecting a historical development, but all of them paying allegiance to this basic proposition that the governed have a right to participate in the process of governance. So there have been different experiments, from Marx's Paris Commune, which he wrote about, on to the revolutions, Russian, Chinese, so on and so forth. Um, and the debate goes on to the Latin American, Mexican, the Zapatistas. In Africa, you have those who believe that there were forms of village governance which preceded colonialism, which we should learn from. It is endless and it should be endless because there's no final answer to these questions, and there shouldn't be. Once we accept a final answer, then it'll turn into a religion.
Hi. Such an amazing conversation. Thank you, Mahmood Saab. So to apply your lessons on from South Africa and America, particularly the distinction you made between political and criminal violence and hence political and criminal justice to Pakistan, right? So is there hope for political justice in a country that was created on the foundation of an ethno-religious supremacy? Of Sunni Muslims, essentially, right? And a state that has a vested interest in upholding this exclusionary story that it was manufactured and formalized and entrenched by the state and all its institutions.
He's an expert on Pakistan.
Not really, but on ethno-religious supremacy. Look, the thing is that whatever logic was said to explain the nature of the state that governs us today can be critiqued. And the state can be reformed, recreated, based on a different logic. And what I propose in this book is that we need to separate the notion of the nation from the notion of the state. The state has to be a state of all its citizens, all of them, which is actually what in Israel, Palestine, the Balad Party, which was a Palestinian party, in 2000, I think soon after the Second Intifada, introduced in Parliament, a representative of Balad Party introduced, Azmi Bishara, introduced in Parliament an amendment of the Israeli, not constitution, but they don't have a constitution, but basic law, that Israel should be a state of all its citizens, not a state of Jews. Okay. And of course, that's when
Does that work?
he had to flee.
Does that work? Does the idea of Israel for all citizens work at all?
That's the next session.
Yeah, I know that. And tomorrow. That's why I didn't ask my Israel.
I'll tell you that. You've given me advance warning. So I have 24 hours to prepare for it.
Thank you very much. It was great session. In some cases, colonizers left the country, but they left their mark. In our case, like we have British trained army, and at times we feel that Pakistan army is getting dictations from international establishments like American army, British army, and something like that. So your comments, please.
Well, first of all, you're completely right. And this is what's distinctive about modern colonialism. Pre-modern colonialism or imperialism was basically about they came, controlled a place, and they plundered. They killed the men, they took the women, they took the loot, and they ran off. Or the Romans in the West, their soldiers established what they call colonies, which was a very early form of settler colonialism. But modern colonialism is about establishing a set of institutions. I think one of the first books that kind of saw through this, glimpsed it, understood it, was Gandhi's book, Hind Swaraj, which he wrote in South Africa. And Gandhi was saying that if we go the direction in which we are going, we will have created an England in India without Englishmen. The Englishmen will have gone, but we'll be living in England. And why? Because we are sort of absorbing, internalizing all the institutions they introduced in India. Gandhi was, of course, preoccupied with the legal profession, and he hated it in particular. But law, medicine, etc., etc., etc. It's a very short book, but it's a very interesting book.
We've been told we've got 5 minutes, so there's a question. We'll take one question there and one question there. और अगर वक्त मिल गया तो आपके पास आएंगे. ठीक है, वक्त मिल गया तो इधर आएंगे. ये दो, we'll take these two together, yours and yours. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, my question is about, you're talking about state and institution, right? So what about a state, some of its citizens that have not accepted the concept of state yet, and they're still living with a tribal mindset in a tribal setup, and they would prefer to live over there because they could think of state as a very westernized and a very modern or something alienated to them. And I would say that you give them the institution that are very differently developed from what is theirs. How would the state or the state apparatus operate over there?
Let's take the second one because they've told us that we have to stop. They don't have time. Yeah.
So thank you, Mamdani. I have two related questions, and I say two in a sense. So going
Two.
back to two, but
Every
they're
person,
related.
one question.
But they're related.
Sorry,
They
it's
might.
your job.
So initially, as Zaidi sahab pointed out, an economist, so you made this distinction between politics and the in reference to extraction theory or dependency theory. So it appeared to me, and it also later on from the conversation, it appears that your comment that we have to distinguish between nation and state. So it appears that that you think that it is possible to separate the politics from like economic. And I don't want to be a crude like Marxist theory, but there are more complex versions of that base and superstructure. So in that sense, do you think that is really possible? And that takes me to the second point, nation and state. So like in Pakistani context and in most of these post-colonial or neo-colonial states, whatever you want to call them, is it that simple that we decide that, okay, this is the sort of nation we want, or this is the sort of state we want, and that can be like it's not organically grown, that it is easily possible to distinguish the two and also reform both of these categories. Your thoughts on this?
Okay, thank you. I like the question on tribe and state. The question applies in the African context even more than in the Pakistani or Indian contexts. My own feeling is that both tribe and state are colonial constructs. The British arrived at tribe as the way to control groups of people that they found very hard to control. They found it almost impossible to control them. And these were usually groups which were pastoralist or semi-pastoralist. They kept cattle. The kind of discipline they needed to nurture in order to just practice grazing and moving with cattle was the discipline which gave them military skills. So a whole specialization in British statecraft was how to deal with these people. In the subcontinent, they would classify some of them into criminal tribes, but it didn't work really. Others into martial tribes. So the thing is that it's the same with the Native American Indian thing, the reservation, which is a caricature of what we call tribal democracy, or which is a caricature of the democracy that existed before colonialism. Right? So the main point is that both those who live under the state and those who live under tribal forms have a common demand, which is democracy. We have to figure out how to translate this democracy into institutions and how to make sure that the institutions in some ways reflect the historicity of the place and the peoples. So to come to the next question, I'm not really talking of collapsing, either of collapsing politics and economics or of just building a Chinese wall between them. I was talking of culture and politics. I was talking of separating the nation from the state. The nation is not the economy. The nation is, if you were to quote Stalin's classic definition, it would really be about developing a common consciousness on a piece of common territory. It's about culture. And that's the problem, politicizing culture. Because culture cannot be equated with territory. Now, we know this now with notions of diaspora. There are diasporas all over the place with migration. And so you share the same culture with many people who live beyond the borders of Pakistan. But that has nothing to do with sharing sovereignty over the same piece of land. So that sovereignty is about law. And that law should apply to everybody who lives on the land, regardless of cultural difference. And conversely, everybody who lives on the land should have a meaningful part in devising the law and the law-making process. That's what I'm talking about. I certainly think that economics is very important. All I would want to say about politics is that if you negate the role of politics, and if you think that change is economically determined, then you can forget about revolutionary change, you can forget about radical change, because every time, every revolution, Lenin recognized this more than anybody else probably, and Mao. Every radical revolution is about breaking the inertia of the economy, in a sense. I mean, the South Africans tried to do it with apartheid. They realized that in a way the economy was, demands of the economy were moving people, and they'd created this whole migrant system. And the solution, from their point of view, would be not to turn the semi-proletariat of the migrant system into a full urban proletariat. And they were significantly successful, not fully, by creating these Bantustans and making sure that people had their village and they had to go back every 6 months. But thank you very much.
No, that's where we end. Please join me in thanking Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Thank you. He's around if you want to ask questions once we are asked to leave the room. So, go ahead. Thank you, Mahmood.
Are you volunteering me? No, there's a session tomorrow. We have a session tomorrow.